رحم الله من أعادها ثانية.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
ثالثة على المولى أبي عبد الله الحسين بأعلى أصواتكم تؤجرون.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. In the name of Allah, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon our holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. May God's peace and blessings be upon our Imam Al-Hussein, as well as his companions and the family members who sacrificed their lives with him. To continue where we left off yesterday, and this will be the second part of two parts about the transition from knowledge and faith to action in Islam. And then we will take this as a foundation, as a theoretical foundation, and apply it for much more practical considerations, inshallah, in the nights to come. Yesterday, where we left off, we said that one of the laws and principles that God has established in His religion is that in order to get access to a special kind of guidance, that guidance which we may refer to as tawfiq, and in which the circumstances and conditions and causes in one's life converge and combine together in a way that becomes in favor of producing results such as faith and more knowledge. To gain access to that special kind of guidance, we said that there is one rule, one law that God has put in place, and it is as simple as making an effort. Striving, struggling, making an effort in the path of God opens the gates to gain that special kind of guidance. Before going into the more scriptural, more narrational way of understanding this, which means looking at the Quran and the Hadith, one little remark. When we say that there are rules and laws that have been put in place, it is because we believe that God has created the universe, the world, in a way that is very meticulous, very accurate. There are precise laws and precise principles that guide every aspect of the universe. This applies as much for things that we now call the hard sciences, for instance, biology and chemistry and physics, and scientists spend their lives studying those laws. There are also laws that govern the non-material world. For instance, Islam tells us one of the laws that govern the non-material world is that if someone honors and respects and obeys their parents, the consequence is that God prolongs their life and increases their fortune. This is a non-material law that exists in the non-material dimension of the universe. There are groups in Islam who do not believe in this kind of structure. When we say that God has made principles and laws and rules through which we can access these things, there are groups in Islam who doubted that. They say that if God is the absolute master absolute owner and sovereign over the universe and all of its laws, then he can do whatever he wants. No law can impose anything on the Lord. And we reply to them by saying, we agree with you that God is the ultimate absolute owner, possessor, creator, sovereign of the universe, but we disagree with you that God will not respect these rules and laws because God has told us that He imposed them on Himself. Not because we deem, not because our reason and intellect make these laws and rules. It is God who decided to follow these principles and these rules Himself. When He says, for instance, كَتَبَ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ الرَّحْمَةِ, He imposed mercy upon Himself. So when we say that there are rules and principles and laws that govern the non-material world, that's what we mean. Now if we move on to the principle itself. Yesterday we said that to access the special guidance, we need to make an effort. So where do we find this in our scriptures? First, I'll mention very quickly, a hadith Qudsi. Hadith Qudsi basically means a narration that is reported from God directly. It is not Quran, but it comes directly from God, where God is the speaker in the hadith. We'll start with that and then move on to the Quranic verses. In one narration, the Lord says, أَنَا عِنْدَ ظَنِّ عَبْدِي وَأَنَا مَعَهُ إِذَا ذَكَرَنِي. I honor the expectations of my servant, and I am with my servant if he remembers me. That's the prelude, the beginning. Then he says, فَإِذَا ذَكَرَنِي فِي نَفْسِهِ ذَكَرْتُهُ فِي نَفْسِي. If he remembers me in himself or by himself, then I remember him in myself or by myself. Now to understand these words, basically when we think about the universe, God cares, God remembers everything in the universe at the same time. Otherwise, the universe and everything in it would cease to exist. But sometimes God makes a point to insist on something in addition to this general care of the Lord. For instance, in the Quran, when at some point God is speaking with Moses, peace upon him and our Prophet, He says, وَأَلْقَيْتُ عَلَيْكَ مَحَبَّةً مِنِّي وَلِتُصْنَعَ عَلَى عَيْنِي. And I have covered you with a clothing of love so that you may grow under my watch. Everything grows under God's watch. But God makes it a point to mention it to Moses, one of his greatest prophets. He tells him that I want you to grow under my watch. This is the guidance we're talking about. So here when God says that if you remember me in yourself, I will remember you in myself, this is already showing us that we gain access to that kind of special guidance and special care by being remembered in the special sense by the Lord. The hadith keeps going. وَمَنْ ذَكَرَنِي فِي مَلَإٍ ذَكَرْتُهُ فِي مَلَإٍ خَيْرٍ مِّنْهِ. If you remember me in public, I will remember you in a better public. We know that that better public is because God said, I remember him in myself. That's the beginning of that public. That public also has the prophets and the angels. What better public than to be mentioned and remembered in? The hadith goes on to say, وَإِذَا تَقَرَّبَ مِنِّي شِبْرًا تَقَرَّبْتُ إِلَيْهِ ذِرَاعًا. If he comes towards me by the distance of one shibr, was translated as a foot, then I will go towards him by a yard, by a dhira'. an arm's length. وَإِذَا تَقَرَّبَ إِلَيَّ ذِرَاعًا تَقَرَّبْتُ إِلَيْهِ بَاعًا. And if he comes towards me by the distance of an arm's length, I will go towards him the distance of al-ba' is the distance from the fingertip to the fingertip. When you extend your arms, this is a ba'. So a yard by a ba'. وَمَنْ أَتَانِيَ مَاشِيًا أَتَيْتُهُ هَرْوَلًا. And whoever comes to me walking, I shall go to him running. This hadith is basically telling us that the Lord is making a promise that in the relationship between yourself and the Lord, every time you invest in that relationship, the Lord will invest as much and then exceed it. He's making a bigger effort than you are. This is what we're talking about when we say all you need to do is make an effort. When we look at the Quran says in much shorter terms. It says, وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. If you struggle, if you strive, if you exert energy in the cause of the Lord, then the Lord will guide you towards His pathways. Two things to mention about this verse. The first is that notice the word struggle and strive. الَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا. No one said it's going to be easy. But in return, God promises to give you access to guide you in that special guidance. لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. And notice as well, the plural of sabil, in this case, subul, the pathways to the Lord are multiple. Keep that in mind for the nights to come, inshallah. Keeping this in mind, now let us look at the notion of action in the Quran. First of all, the Quranic theory about action is that it is necessary. Action is a duty. In Islam, you are ordered. There is a divine command to act. The first verse to start this says, وَقُلْ اعْمَلُوا. This is an order, an imperative form of the verb that says, O Muhammad, say, act. فَسَيَرَى اللَّهُ عَمَلَكُمْ وَرَسُولُهُ وَالْمُؤْمِنُونَ. So that God may see your action and His messenger and the believers. So first of all, notice that there's a duty to act. There's a command. You have no choice. If you're obeying God, you act. Secondly, there is a quick remark here because there's some difference of opinion amongst the scholars about who those believers are in the verse. When the verse says that those who will witness your action are God, His messenger, and the believers. So at first, one would think what is meant by the believers is the community of the faithful. Whoever commits an action, performs an action, that action will be witnessed by the community of believers. But that action, if that's the real interpretation of the verse, is witnessed by everybody, not just the believers. So what is so special about those believers? That they see something when they witness your action that no one else sees, and they are the only ones who are mentioned in the verse as witnessing your action. The difference when God notices your action is because He also witnesses the intention behind the action. So of course God is going to witness the action and the intention. But God has also told us that He gave this responsibility and the ability that comes with the responsibility to His messenger to witness the action and the intention, and a group of believers. When we go back to the sayings of Ahlul Bayt, they tell us that if they are the imams, our imams are the ones who will witness our actions and the intentions behind them. If I may just pause here for one quick moral remark and then we move on. This can be very important for all of us. Knowing that our actions are not only being witnessed by God, although the Quran says that should suffice, that should be enough, that God witnesses everything. Unfortunately, human beings in general are very material creatures. It's difficult for us to go beyond the matter. It's difficult for us to believe and to get to fully understand things that are beyond the matter. We want to identify with things that are close to us. That's why the Quran says that God did not send angels to humanity. He sent other human beings to them so that you identify with them. So if we come back to this verse, and I speak for myself, in most cases we may lack the faith to remember that God is witnessing our actions. But when the Quran adds the messenger and the imams, it may make it a little bit easier for us to remember that we are always being watched. We are always under scrutiny. Everything we do, including the intentions behind our actions, is being witnessed. So this can be, of course, as a source of pride and positivity. You can stand all alone at night after everyone is asleep, and when you perform your prayer, you know that the Imam is witnessing your prayer. But at the same time, also remember that the same Imam, for instance, the Imam for whom you come to commemorate his sacrifice, to express your loyalty and adherence to his values, that same Imam is also witnessing you when you're about to perform a sin. And it becomes difficult for you to even think about performing a sin if you can just remember at that moment that you are being witnessed by your Imam. And I say this because in reality we shouldn't need to resort to this. If we had the faith, the full faith required, knowing that God is watching over us. But at least out of our weakness, if we think that another human being, a human being we care about, a human being whom we respect, whom we hold sacred, is witnessing every action and every intention, this may help us to grow spiritually. Now, if we move on to the next part, there is, in religion, if we have understood everything that we have said so far, two big parts. One part is faith and the knowledge that becomes faith, and the other part is the action that follows. You cannot have one without the other. If the action does not follow from the faith, you cannot consider that faith. Yesterday we tried to make a distinction between knowledge and faith. We said that you may know a lot of things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have faith in them. So one criteria that the Quran gives us to know whether what we know has actually become faith or not is to see whether it produces action. That's why every time in the Quran, when there's a mention of faith, when there's a mention of Iman, right away the Quran says, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. The proof that this is actually Iman and not just an empty knowledge is that there is an action that results. عَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, a righteous, good action that results from faith. Having understood all of this, صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.
صل على محمد وآل محمد.
The Quran tells us that there is a dynamic relationship between knowledge and faith. They both have an influence on each other. So now we're going to try to understand what that interaction is. Which one is more important? Which one really matters? What's the different roles that they play? The Quran says, أَلَمْ تَرَ كيف ضرب الله مثلا كلمة طيبة كشجرة طيبة أصلها ثابت وفرعها في السماء تؤتي أكلها كل حين بإذن ربها. The Quran is basically saying, have you not seen how Allah has drawn this parable, this example, this lesson to you? Which lesson? The lesson of the good word. كلمة طيبة. Every time the Quran refers to كلمة طيبة, it is actually referring to the correct set of beliefs. The Quran refers to beliefs as كلمة طيبة. So the Quran is saying the example, the likeness of the good word is like that of a good tree. Its trunk and roots are solidly grounded, and its branches are high up in the sky, and in every instant it is producing, it is giving forth fruits by the permission, by the will of its Lord. So if we know that the Quran, when it talks about the good word, is referring to faith, is referring to the set of beliefs, and the Quran is telling us that the beliefs are the trunk and the roots of a tree. But the tree also has branches, and on those branches there are fruits. This entire tree exists to produce the fruits that are on the branches. Obviously, the fruits on those branches are your actions, which derive from the belief and from the knowledge. So now we move on to the next piece. Which is more important? What are the different roles between the two? Knowledge and faith, which are the trunk and the roots, or the fruits of the tree, which are the actions that derive from the trunk and the roots. Here again, we turn to the Quran, and the Quran tells us, إِلَيْهِ يَصْعَدُ الْكَلِمُ الطَّيِّبُ. The same thing. ضرب الله مثلا كلمة طيبة. Now it says إليه يصعد الكلم الطيب والعمل الصالح يرفعه. To God ascends the good word, which we said is the set of beliefs, the faith. When God looks at you, what He wants to see is your essence, is your faith, is the purity of your knowledge. But the Quran says God will not look at it as is. He needs something, another law that God has put into His non-material world. He needs something to elevate the faith, the knowledge to God. And it is your actions that perform that duty. The more actions you perform, the better quantity and quality actions you perform, the better your faith, your iman looks in the eyes of God. Now, we can sense that there's some sort of cycle going on here, but there's something missing, so that it becomes a full cycle. And this we discover in another verse that says, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ وَيُعَلِّمُكُمُ اللَّهُ. If you are able to perform your actions with as much taqwa as possible, with sincerity, with God-fearing, with religiousness, with piety, when you're able to perform your actions with taqwa, God has made another rule that He imposes upon Himself. And that rule is that He will grant you knowledge. Except that this knowledge is different from the one we were talking about yesterday, when we said that you have to start by educating yourself. There's a knowledge that you can acquire in books, by listening to people talk, by thinking and studying and analyzing. It's an acquired knowledge. That's what triggered this whole chain. But now when we're talking about adding the dimension of taqwa and piety and God-fearing in your actions, then God says when the action is sincere, I will give you knowledge, I will grant you knowledge. This knowledge is different. This knowledge is special. If we go to the riwayat of Ahl al-Bayt, in one of the narrations, one of the ahadith of the Imam, he says that knowledge is a light that God places in the heart of those of His servants that He loves. This is the knowledge that the verse is referring to when it says that if you act with taqwa, God will grant you knowledge. It's a divine light through which you start seeing the world in a different way. With this, keeping all of this in mind, we start seeing how the cycle works. You gain a knowledge that you can acquire. You transform that knowledge into faith. You get the guidance that you need. And this faith starts producing actions. And those actions, when you add taqwa to them, start producing more knowledge. And the cycle begins again. Because the knowledge is going to become faith. And faith is going to produce more action, and so on and so forth. This cycle, if we apply it, means that we will continuously be growing and evolving spiritually. Faith increases and embetters your actions, and your actions improve and purify your faith, and so on and so forth. This becomes the theoretical foundation to understand the place of knowledge and faith in Islam, and from which every action in Islam is going to spring. And this gives us an idea, a glimpse, a little taste of perhaps what the companions of the Imam were feeling and experiencing, and what it is that enables them to have the conviction, to have the courage of holding steadfast in their beliefs in the face of such adversity and difficulties.
Assalamu alaikum.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So we will use this as our foundation for the nights to come, to move from this very theoretical and abstract foundation that we have laid for faith and knowledge, for much more practical applications and practical considerations for our everyday lives in Islam. We ask God that He grants us a glimpse and a taste of this divine light, so that we may see our world and experience our world in that same way that was experienced by the companions of the Imam. And may God's peace and blessings be upon Imam Al-Hussein and his family members and his companions, and upon you all. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل